Hello friends, you've stumbled across a short clip from the Daily Switch 2 podcast, which, believe it or not, is a podcast that is about the Switch 2 with new episodes released daily. What will they think of next? So the Switch 1 was uniquely good for collectors and third parties and indie games. Why is that? Well, Nintendo has a much longer history than the PlayStation. First PlayStation was in 1994, and that's not even getting into the fact that PlayStation started off as a Nintendo brand. I was actually requested to make a spin-off episode about that, and I definitely will do. We just need to get all this time-sensitive stuff out of the way first. Especially Xbox as a brand has only been around since 2001. They essentially took over when Sega's hardware business died after the Dreamcast. Don't forget, Microsoft were very heavily involved with the Dreamcast, and were considering buying Sega at one point. Nintendo started producing home consoles long before the Xbox in 2001 or the PlayStation in 1994. The first home console from Nintendo was 1977 with the Color TV Game 6, and then the 15, and then the Racing 112, and Block Breaker, and the Othello one, whatever that one was called. And then, of course, the Famicom in 1983, which became the NES, released in the West soon after. Even before they made consoles, though, Nintendo made physical collectible items, playing cards, toys, mechanical games. There has always been a concept of owning a Nintendo thing. And the logo on a product is usually a sign of a certain quality, and the Nintendo seal of quality, so to speak. Xbox and PlayStation as brands, when we look at their marketing, have literally always been tech forward rather than legacy forward. And that makes sense because they are newer brands that had to establish themselves in an existing market. And it's also a key part of their brand identity to be pushing the latest tech, the latest graphics, the coolest, most fashionable thing. So looking back isn't a thing that they often do. And you notice it's only when they start floundering that they do rely on that sometimes. Like, for example, the PS5 wasn't selling very well, didn't have very many exclusive games. Most of the games that people wanted were available on the PS4. People weren't jumping in and buying a PS5 right away. So what do? They release a grey one with a PlayStation 1 logo on it, and suddenly a load of collectors come out of the woodwork and say, okay, now's the time when I'm going to buy a PS5. And I know multiple people who did that, by the way, and I was sorely tempted myself. Now, even though Nintendo wants to appeal to cool adults as well as children, they have a family-friendly approach, and their market appeal when advertising directly towards older gamers who aren't parents often revolves around nostalgia for the times playing their games when you were young, or refinding parts of yourself from your childhood that you lost as you became old and cynical. Therefore, a bit like Disney adults, and by the way, I could probably be described as a Disney adult, apologies, the most passionate of Nintendo's older fans associate Nintendo as something to collect and display. Nintendo has always been a toy brand, and it feeds into the modern aspect of adults collecting figurines, wearing brand t-shirts, collector's editions of games, etc. The adults that like to buy and display toys in inverted commas because they're collectibles. And again, that applies to me. I'm not being snarky. That's not to say that Sony or Microsoft don't have that aspect too. I, for example, personally collect Parappa the Rapper items. But it's not the biggest and most profitable part of their business. It's the mainstream titles like FIFA, Call of Duty, etc., which essentially become worthless once the latest and greatest title is released. Even the big AAA single-player titles like Last of Us, Tsushima, Uncharted, etc., they're seen as more temporary, like blockbuster movies, than collectible treasures that you'll still be playing in 20 years' time and might be worth something if you keep a sealed copy, like with Nintendo games. And as for indie games, that focus for Nintendo players wanting physical is 10 times more the case, especially if they are retro-styled titles that will specifically appeal to the people who still worship the NES, SNES, Game Boy, and N64 titles and like to collect and display them. Now, sure, Steam on the PC will always be the first place that most indie titles make it big, but once they become a cult classic, fans want a physical version to put on their shelf. It's a Switch cartridge they want, baby. It's the whole reason companies like Limited Run and Super Rare, etc. exist, and they were so successful that now I know of at least 40 similar companies putting out short runs of small indie games on the Switch. And some developers even decide to publish their own games and finance runs of physical Switch carts via Kickstarter or with existing revenue from their digital sales. And this was all made possible because, one, after the Wii U spectacularly failed and almost all third parties quickly jumped ship, Nintendo was desperate for games and basically let almost anyone develop games, mobile titles, asset flips, students' first games, etc. for the Switch 1. Now that led to a lot of rubbish, but it also led to some really amazing gems of indie titles being there if you could sort through the rubbish. And again, that's kind of what the physical copies exist for. If it's got a physical copy, it's probably worth playing. 2. The large market existed for Nintendo fans already being used to collecting and displaying physical games, like the aforementioned NES cartridges, and even seeing them as a future investment, especially games with short print runs, like the limited runs, etc. People might think, for example, of Shantae on the Game Boy Color as an example of a very valuable title to own because not very many copies of it were produced. And 3, the Switch 1 game cartridges are extremely affordable, even down to the point that an individual person who programs a Switch game in their bedroom could potentially take out a loan and finance a small print run of their Switch 1 title to sell to their fans on social media, especially for indie and retro games which tend to not need very much storage, so they can use the cheaper cartridge sizes. The whole game keycard not having the game on the cartridge is not 100% new like people seem to think. There are third-party games which aren't on the cartridge. The cartridge, then says, oh, you have to download this or you have to download that. I think the reason why people are getting so up in arms about this is because it's predominantly not people who collect the AAA multi-plat games that are available on everything that care. It's the people that collect those kind of short-run indie titles, pixel art, retro-style games, or kind of weird, more esoteric. There's not going to be very many of them, so you buy them as an investment thing. Anime games, RPGs, things that... Those are the kind of things that the real die-hard physical collectors gravitated towards the Switch 1 for. For smaller games that could fit on them, there is no reason why the same 4, 8, 16 and 32GB Macronic cards being used on Switch 1 games can't be put in red plastic and used for Switch 2 games, even if those games are exclusive for the Switch 2. There is zero reason, other than Nintendo don't want to. It's the same tech. Why wouldn't they want to? Well, because, as we said, Nintendo want to nudge consumers not so subtly towards going digital only, because they make much more money from a digital sale at full price than they do if they have to share it with retailers, etc. They knew that there would be outcry about $80 Mario Kart, and they did that on purpose so that they could make the bundle $30 cheaper to make it seem like a bargain by comparison, even though the console itself is quite expensive. But it only contains a download for the game and not the physical cartridge. So your very first experience of the system is likely with a digital download game. You learn the process to get comfortable with it, especially a parent or a grandparent who's just bought that console as a present and is helping the child set it up. They learn the process of, oh, I have to download the game. That's unusual. It didn't used to be like that, but now they know what to do. And you get used to the convenience of having the game there on the console whenever you want it without needing to find the cartridge. They're hoping to train consumers out of thinking of Nintendo as being a physical collectible, because if they succeed to not lose their customers, but instead retrain them, it's far more profitable and they retain more control. But I think that they vastly underestimated how much this affects how many of their customers. If you follow the whole history of Nintendo's console releases, there have been very high highs, but they've also nearly had to drop out of the home console market entirely several times. And the two things that saved them, time and time again, were their handheld division, specifically Pokemon, and the true hardcore shelf collectors, who even in times of trouble buy every new minor re-release, hardware refresh and color variety that they release. Guilty as charged. Sorry, it's my fault. In fact, there is actually a lot of crossover there. A large amount of the biggest Pokemon enthusiasts buy both or even all three releases of every mainline game. Red, blue, yellow, etc. And many of them also collect every new Pokemon-themed console release, Pokemon-themed joypads, etc. Again, going back to Nintendo's roots of making physical playing cards and toys, Pokemon is a franchise that mostly succeeds because its fans want to collect physical stuff. Cards, plushies, toys, gotta catch 'em all. It's the whole appeal. But it's the same with Zelda fans also. Having financial difficulties and the mainstream gamers aren't buying your console, just re-release an old Zelda game with an HD upscale and package it with a brand new, mildly Zelda-themed console that you call limited edition because you put a sticker on it and painted it. But you make millions of them, even though you say it's limited edition, and fans will not only re-buy a game that they already own and have played a million times, but they will buy a whole new console or handheld despite already buying the original day one. When the original Game Boy stopped selling, but they weren't ready to release the next model, we got the Play It Loud color variants. When the N64 was floundering again because we didn't have enough third-party games, we got the Fantastic models, etc., etc. Many fans collected all of them. When you see them proudly displayed behind every YouTuber and streamer, it's like a rite of passage if you're a Nintendo collector to prove your worth. How many different Game Boys do you have? How many different versions of the Switch did you buy? The Switch one was an enormous success, almost entirely due to this collector's impulse. When PlayStation and Xbox pivoted to being digital only, and even the Blu-ray version stopped having the games on the actual disc, and yes, I do know that, by the way, I've had a million people point that out in the comments. I did actually mention it, but a lot of people leave comments without listening to the whole video. I understand, I talk a lot. It's fine if you don't listen all the way through. Thank you for watching, I'm not complaining. But even the Blu-ray version stopped having the games on the disc, and collectors of physical media just went all in on the Switch at that point. Third parties, especially smaller, more niche developers, went all in too, and it was a match made in heaven. Despite the console selling over 150 million units, there are likely no more than 50 million unique users. So that means a large amount of consumers bought 3, 4 or more console varieties. Perhaps the Switch Lite and OLED, but I'm going to bet that many bought Zelda, Animal Crossing, Mario variants of the console. These are people who are either buying as future investments or because they want to display them proudly on the shelf. And many of those will not want to display a game keycard or a code in a box. And if they eventually feel forced to go digital only and not have anything physical at all, they'll just stop caring about collecting entirely. It's an entirely different mindset to gaming. Game collecting and gaming are not the same thing. There's crossover, but they're not the same. And Nintendo predominantly sells to collectors, and a lot of their collectors don't play everything that they collect. Nintendo are currently chasing the casual hardcore market, especially the Western ones, i.e. the people that want to play Call of Duty, FIFA, Madden, Fortnite. Those guys are not going to suddenly shift allegiance from the PlayStation, Xbox or PC to Nintendo. It's just not the same brand appeal. It's a different demographic entirely. And if any of those people want to play digital games portably, they're more likely to buy a Steam Deck or a ROG Ally like the upcoming Xbox branded one. Digital-only games will always be cheaper on Windows and Linux-based systems, and newer, more powerful tech can be released every few months with companies like that. Nintendo just can't compete there. It's not their strength. Well, that was funny / sad / informative / stupid, wasn't it? Feel free to mentally redact to make that make sense with the clip that you just heard. I don't know what it was. I'm just recording a bumper. But if you enjoyed the clip, please give it a like. If you'd like to hear more, click subscribe, and you can find all the ways to listen to and support the full daily podcast at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/daily switch 2. Let's go. Did I sound like I mean that? I do. I really do.